Vice Chair Reva Chambliss. It's time to begin this meeting of the Committee of the Whole. It's Wednesday, September 20th, 2023, and I will call this meeting to order. Normally we ask if there are any changes to the agenda. I am still expecting a couple more council members to arrive, so I would like to ask that we modify the agenda a little bit and move the approval of the whole minutes to after the information items. Is there any objection to that? No, okay. So with that, I would like to ask if there are any changes, additional changes to the agenda, and I'm seeing none, so we'll move on. The first order of business is the information item. We have 3 information items this evening, and we'll begin with the Transit Rider Investment Program presented by Lesley Kandaras. Hello.
Good afternoon, Chair Chambliss, committee members. My name is Lesley Kandaras, and I'm the Metro Transit General Manager. I'm just going to briefly introduce this item and then hand it over to Leah Palmer, who's our interim manager of the Transit Rider Investment Program. But basically, just wanted to say a few words to put this item in some broader context. As you'll hear from Leah, the Transit Rider Investment Program was one of the provisions included in the Transportation Omnibus Bill that passed this past May. But some of the pieces of this program are something that Metro Transit has been working on for several years. So tracing back at least to 2018, Metro Transit has been looking at how we provide official presence on our system and how we handle fare enforcement on our proof of payment lines, which are off-board payment lines, the bus rapid transit system and the light rail transit system. We've been looking at peer agencies, have talked to several agencies that have moved in this direction of having some form of ambassador or other non-sworn personnel, and have moved towards having a civil rather than a criminal penalty for fare non-compliance. So actually back in 2019 was the first year that the council had a bill in front of the legislature to create the Administrative Citations Program, which is one part of this Transit Rider Investment Program that Leah will speak more about. So we've really been pursuing this for several years. It's part of the original Safety and Security Action Plan action items that you saw last year as well. But just to give some sense of why we started down this path in the first place, for one, we really see this as an opportunity to increase official presence on our system, provide more personnel that add more eyes and ears to our system. Prior to the law change this year, fare non-compliance, riding without paying your fare, was a misdemeanor under state law. It carried a $180 penalty. And it was also something that only our sworn police officers were inspecting and enforcing. This change in law, and as you'll hear Leah describe, allows us to create a new set of personnel that won't be police officers and will be able to do routine fare inspection, write citations, and also provide other forms of assistance to our customers. So that's just a little bit of background to the fact that even though this legislation's new, we're still it's still under development, and we're really looking forward to your feedback tonight. It's something that we've been working on for quite some time because we feel it's going to be a more effective way to address fare non-compliance on our system and also just improve overall sense of safety and security on our system as well. So with that little bit of history, I am going to turn it over to Leah Palmer, who is serving as our interim manager of this program.
Thank you, Lesley. Chair Chambliss, council members, as Lesley said, my name is Leah Palmer, and I'm serving as the interim manager of this project. So looking at what we're going to talk about today, we're going to talk a little bit about the overview of the program, including the legislation that was passed, the stakeholder engagement work that we've done. We'll talk about some survey results that we've received. We're going to talk about that personnel piece that Lesley had mentioned, the citations. We're going to talk about how we can measure our outcomes and how we can look at what we're doing. And we'll talk a little bit about a timeline as well. So what is the Transit Rider Investment Program? As I said, it was established back in this season's legislature in 2023. And it says, subject to available funds, the council must implement the Transit Rider Investment Program that provides for the trip personnel deployment, fare payment inspection, administrative citation issuance, rider education and assistance, and improvements to the transit experience. I think that's really an encompassing way to look at how we're looking at improving that rider experience and improving conditions. So stakeholder engagement was part of the legislation, but it's also something that we've been doing for a very long time. And you'll see here, and you may recall back in 2020 in the fall, I believe, we've started some of those transit safety conversations. We had the Citizens League go out and do some work and report back. That report led to our police work group that was chaired by Councilmember Chambliss. And from that fed the Safety and Security Action Plan that we've been presenting now for, gosh, a year and a half already. So looking then forward, this summer we've done the Great Day in Transit survey, which I'll talk about in a moment. We've also been talking to our own employees and getting a pulse on how they feel. And then we're going to be doing regular check-ins with our customers and stakeholders as we continue to move forward. So the Great Day in Transit survey. So the Great Day in Transit is an initiative that started actually in June and is continuing. In fact, today is one of our Great Day in Transit days. So what it is staff of any variety across Metro Transit and Met Council can go out on the transit system and talk with customers and check in, see how things are going, say hi to operators and other staff that are out there, and just get a pulse on really what's happening on our system. So in June and July, thank you, Metro Transit engaged in a survey. So when they were out there talking with folks, they had a survey that riders could take, and then that survey was also distributed through the Connect newsletter that goes out, as well as outreach events like National Night Out, for instance. So through the course of this, we received over 2,000 responses, and almost 60% of those respondents ride at least a few times a week. So we know that these are folks that are engaged in transit. What we found is that most riders want to see the trip personnel on the light rail system. And you can see the survey results are ranked there. They had 4 options, and the top 2 are the light rail, and the bottom 2 are the bus stops and onboard buses. And that's, proof of payment systems are both the bus rapid transit as well as the light rail. So we will be deploying on both, but it was good to get a sense from our community about what they're seeing and what they're feeling. It should be noted too that of the Great Day in Transit surveys, the in-person surveys, a lot of those were conducted at LRT stations, and so that may have affected results. So just take that with a grain of salt, I suppose. And then the majority of riders indicated that trip personnel should really focus more on reporting issues and enforcing fares. So 61% reported that they would prefer that trip personnel address safety issues and enforcing fares, and 39% on helping customers and find their way and things like that. And that isn't going to change what we do. We are still going to be enforcing fares. We're still going to be assisting customers. But again, it was good to get a pulse on how our customers are feeling. So the trip personnel duties. This is in legislation, and it tells us what they're going to be doing and what they're going to be doing. They're going to be educating riders about the code of conduct, and that's going to say, there's no smoking on the platform. You can't drink alcohol here. Things like that tell people, remind people, these are not transit behaviors. We're going to connect passengers to social services as appropriate. So one of the things I'm doing is working with Selena Martina, who's heading up that transit safety investment program, the $2 million TSIP program. She's, as you guys voted on last week, got the community groups coming on board. So I would like to pair the trip personnel with the community agencies that we've gotten and have those folks work together, cross-train, and really make that more of a seamless relationship. They're going to assist with routes and wayfinding and directions. Certainly people aren't sure what bus to connect to or which way the green line goes, things like that. It happens all the time. They're going to provide aid to passengers with disabilities or who are elderly or just may need assistance, for instance, crossing over a crosswalk or boarding a bus or boarding a light rail vehicle. And then they'll be trained to administer basic first aid, naloxone, which is Narcan, and then they'll call for medical help. They'll have a radio that goes to our dispatch center, and they'll be able to request an ambulance to the scene. And the legislation does require that they carry Narcan and administer it if needed. So the personnel piece. So negotiations with the ATU began in January of 2023 and are continuing. The ATU contract specifies that any fare inspectors that aren't part of the police department need to be part of their contract, so we are working with them on that piece. Recruitment is in legislation, and it will be focused on riders. It's going to be focused on underserved communities, and we found that to be really successful campaign so far with our operator hiring, so it's a lot going to be mirrored on that successful model. We're going to be hiring up to 22 FTEs at this time, and future growth, continuing to evaluate, continuing to see what we need to do. So the training piece is obviously very important. Instructors are subject matter experts. They're coming from inside Metro Transit, they're coming from our community, again, partnering with our social service agencies, community-based Narcan training, and then the experts that we have inside Metro Transit and the Instruction Center and Transit Police and plenty of others. Trying to address all the ways that people learn. We'll have classroom instruction, we'll have scenarios, and we'll have field training to really get people to embrace what it is that they would be doing. And then the modules that are required by the legislation that we'll be addressing will be the fare products and administrative citations, quite a bit of time of training on that as a primary purpose. Identification of people in need. How do you know someone may be needing assistance? How do you address that situation? How do you address that person? The first aid CPR and Narcan, and then the crisis intervention, conflict de-escalation, personal safety. We want our people out there to be safe. We want them to be able to do their jobs, and we want those two things to happen together. So the legislation calls for a deployment plan that puts trip personnel in teams, and we foresee team being 2, but we'd really like to see them working in 3s at least. And then focus on times and locations where we know that more assistance is needed, that there is more activity, there's more activity that negatively impacts a rider experience, so we want to put our people in places where they can do the best work. And how are we going to do that? We're going to be looking at customer and employee feedback. We're going to be looking at calls for service. How many calls are we getting at a particular location? We're going to be looking at police data to find out what are the police seeing, what are our customers seeing, and put all those things together to determine our deployment plan. We're going to be coordinating with transit police to ensure that everybody is safe. And our primary focus, again, is on those proof of payment lines, which the legislation has more or less required by having us focus on fare inspection. So fare compliance. Our goal is really to provide visible presence of inspecting fares. We believe that when people see that, they're more likely to comply, they're more likely to feel more comfortable, they see that presence out there. So it's not about writing people up, for lack of a better term, it's about being a presence, and it's about enforcing the rules that do exist. So as Lesley mentioned, the old law was a misdemeanor. Police were the only ones that could enforce it, and it was a $180 fine, for not paying a $2.50, fare. It seemed out of balance. So legislation created a new law that created an administrative citation, which is non-criminal. It's basically a civil process that we'll be handling inside Metro Transit. It's going to be enforceable by the trip personnel as well as police and CSO, so it really broadens the pool of people that can address fare evasion. It's going to start at a $35 fine, and we're going to tier it up to $100, and you'll see in a future slide what that's going to look like, and that's an ask from you all as the legislation requires that you adopt it. And it allows for alternatives to fines on the first violation, and again, we'll talk about that more in a minute. It does require a process for someone to appeal their citation, and that's an important part, and the person hearing the appeal needs to not be an employee of Metro Transit. That's also a really important part to remaining impartial and providing for fairness. So our riders and customers are going to see people out there on the platforms. They're going to see them on board the vehicles. They're going to see them at transit centers. We're going to try to be as visible and across the system as we can be. There's a strong focus in my mind on equity and inspection and enforcement. That means that we're going to be systematically checking fares, one end of the vehicle to the other, one end of the platform to the other. It's not going to be spot checks. It's not going to be saying, oh, you or you or you. We want it to be fair. We want it to be equitable, which means everybody. The cited individuals, when they receive the citation, they're going to get an envelope. They're going to get information on how to pay that ticket and also on how to appeal the ticket. And then they'll, of course, be trained on how to de-escalate circumstances. People may not be happy to be receiving a ticket. So, there may be circumstances, and our folks will be trained on how to do that, as well as, we'll be working with the police department. So the fine schedule that we're proposing to you all, as I mentioned, the legislation allows for alternative payments, or alternatives to payment on the first violation. So that first violation can't be less than 35, so it's going to be 35. And we're proposing a couple of different alternatives. So for instance, if you put $20 on a go-to card, on that stored value card, we'll forgive $15. Point is, we just want you to be compliant. This isn't intended to be punitive and a hardcore $35. If you view a transit school video, it's going to reduce your fine to $25, so we're going to take $10 off. So transit school video is something that we're developing, and it's based on a few other agencies as well. It's going to be a reasonably short video that somebody will view, and it's going to cover why a fair payment is important, why it's expected, our code of conduct, some things like that that we really want to remind people are important to providing a safe and secure transit system. If they view that video and put $10 on the go-to card or the stored value card, then we'll forgive $25. We feel that they've engaged and are really understanding. And then if they're eligible, they can load $5 onto a transit assistance program pass. The transit assistance program, I believe everyone's heard about just at a high level. There's an eligibility based on different things. For instance, if you are receiving SNAP benefits, if you receive WIC benefits, if you are on public assistance, Minnesota Care, I always mess that up, I'm sorry. Some different things like that. If you can show that you meet those requirements, you'll be eligible for the TAP program. We'll sign you up and just ask you to put on $5. The second violation, 55, just kind of is. Third violation and the fourth violation, you can see how they tier up. And we've enhanced the penalty to include prohibiting them from accessing transit for 60 or 120 days. And that is also based on some research that we've done with other agencies. For instance, Philadelphia, SEPTA in Philadelphia does something similar, and King County in Seattle does something similar. So we know that that's out there. It's something that we're really trying to drive home, that fair enforcement and fair payment is important. And if you're getting to the point where you're at your fourth ticket in a rolling 12 months, then we need you to take it a little more seriously. So how do folks pay their tickets? 3 methods. They can go online, metrotransit.org, and it'll be a credit card payment. They can send in payment. They can send in a check through the mail. And it can also go in person to one of our 2 service centers. One is in downtown Minneapolis and one is in downtown St. Paul. At the service center, they can pay by check, they can pay by cash, or they can pay by credit card. That's also where they would view the transit school video to work out that alternative to payment. Eventually, we'd like to get it online. We're just not quite there yet, but that's a goal. So if somebody wants to appeal their ticket, this is a really important part, both legislatively and in the interest of fairness and providing for our customers. As I mentioned, the legislation requires that the hearing officer cannot be an employee of Metro Transit. So we've been talking to other local municipalities on how do you address this. For instance, you may get a city fine from a city inspector for having your garbage cans, out of your garage when you're not supposed to. Things like that, right? So people want to appeal those tickets. So how do other cities deal with that? And so we found a couple of ways that we can address that, and we're currently working with the Office of General Counsel to work through that process. But overall, what we foresee is that somebody is going to request a hearing through email or in person. And they're going to make that request to the citation clerk, who's then going to arrange a hearing date with the third-party officer. That hearing might be through video conferencing or in person. We want to make it accessible. The hearing officer is going to listen to both sides. They're going to listen to the person who's appealing the ticket, and they're also going to listen to the trip representative. There may be a circumstance where there's differing stories or there's differing points of view. And then that person the hearing officer is going to issue a written decision provided to both parties. So how do we know that we're being successful? How do we know that we're headed in the right direction? So we're going to be collecting a lot of data. And part of this is required by legislation, and part of this is just so that we know, we get a baseline, we can see where we're headed. The trip personnel will be having an activity log, so they're going to indicate hours and locations that they're on the system. So for instance, first part of my day is on the green line from Union Depot to Hamlin, right? And then the second part of my day might be from US Bank to Government Plaza. So, trying to keep them moving throughout the system, but we need to know where they are. We need to know the activity that's happening there. So that'll include the fares that are inspected, the compliance rate, how many citations they've issued. We'll know on the back end administratively how many have been paid, how many were reduced, how many folks took advantage of some of those alternatives to payment, how many were contested and what those outcomes were, and then how many were referred to collection. So if somebody does not handle their fine within 90 days or request that hearing within 90 days, then we can refer to collections. We're also going to collect information on how many riders were assisted, how many folks did we help connect to social services, how many people did we put in touch with, for instance, customer relations, how many people did we say, oh, you can catch the 22 right over here, connect to their different lines, things of that nature. We're also going to be asking and surveying our trip personnel and our own Metro Transit staff, soliciting our customers for feedback to say, how are we doing? Do you see differences? Are you having a different experience, hopefully a more positive one on transit? And our current timeline, here's what we're looking at right now. So September, hopefully this goes well, we would like to appear in front of the Transportation Committee on Monday and the Management Committee on Wednesday. And then with an eye toward appearing in front of the full council on October 11th to ask for a vote on adopting both the policy and the resolution with the fine schedule. So then in quarter 4, we're going to focus on finishing development of the administrative citation program. We've got a real good grasp on it right now. Our revenue operations staff has been working very hard and created a really good system, as I've talked about, and then sort of the behind the scenes things, right? Like how do we track stuff? How do we set up the web store so someone can pay it? Handle routing? What does the citation even look like? So we've got some mock-ups of that and working with, again, the Office of General Counsel and others to make sure that we're doing it right. And then the first part of next year, we're looking at implementing the program. And that is all I have, and I would welcome questions.
Thank you, Leah and Lesley. We've been waiting for this time. As you said, it's been 2+ years to finally get to this point where we're able to get to the action phases. I do have a couple questions, and then I'll open it up to the folks that have their hands raised. And one is, for the program evaluation, as you were giving the presentation, I was thinking about the cost of administration, of making sure that there's payment of the fares and the fees. There's staff costs. There are costs for going to the trials and the hearings. There's costs of, obviously, the staff that have to administer. So my question is, are we evaluating the cost of all of those factors for a $2.50 trip during the rush, the busy times? And what is the revenue impact on operations for when we collect fares from everyone? I think that's important information to know. How much difference is it going to make to collect those fares? I know that there is a social impact because it enforces the rules, and it also helps to make sure that people that are on the light rail, are on the buses, are there for a purpose that they have paid for. So can you answer that or respond?
Yeah, Chair Chambliss and council members, to address the first part, and I'll leave the revenue piece to Lesley, if you can't answer it or if we have to get information later. So you're absolutely right, there are some costs. There's administrative costs associated with this. $35, $100. The administrative costs are considerable, right? I think what we're aiming at is increasing fair compliance. And so it's not about the fines paying for the system, it's more about the increased compliance, making the whole project, work.
Chair Chambliss, I'll just add, I think the framing of your question, thinking about the cost of administration within the frame of program evaluation, I think that's a really good point. And as we're creating the program evaluation plan for this, we'll make sure we're reporting out on those administrative costs. I will say, stepping back to 2019 when we started really thinking about this proposal, we looked at a budget both for office staff and then the actual personnel, the trip agents as we're calling them now, who will be out there. And so it's stuff we've looked at the cost of, but absolutely something we will plan to report as part of program evaluation.
Okay, thank you. And just one more quick thing, and that is with the evaluation, I think it might be important to look at the demographics. How many of those tickets are for individuals that are receiving or in need of social services support, for example. And should we be offering a further reduction of their fees? Because I think that the fee for the TAP is $1 to the bus riders. Should that be reduced to 50 cents or $0 for those that are already part of the SNAP program or WIC or public assistance? Just a thought and something to think about as we're evaluating. Councilmember Carter, I still am stuck on Commissioner.
Yes. Thank you very, very much. I just have to say thank you to staff and also to council members who've been working on this. It's a lot, and welcome by not only me but also by our residents, our transit riders who are responding already to police officers who are on transit, welcoming them, and just really, really glad to see them. And I think also observing some change in behaviors as a result of their mere presence. I know that the trip personnel will also be welcomed. I look forward to seeing them on board, although I know we're not going to see them all the time. We don't see the police officers all the time, but knowing they're there has an effect. I also am glad that they are not sworn officers. We can leave the work of the sworn officers to focus on, those categories of offenses where they really are needed, and trust that this is going to be an implementation that addresses the fair offenses or the needs for help as well. I am a little bit concerned, they are not sworn personnel, and so the education and the training is going to be so critical, as you put it, not only to de-escalate but also to actually be able to enforce fair payment. And so I do want to know, and don't require a large response here, but to know that there is this process of recording, what happened, so we can better understand and plan forward, but also knowing how they not only de-escalate, but they also refer, because there will come a time when they will not be able to hand a ticket to someone. And they will need to refer that to a next step. And how do we handle that? Wanting to make sure that they're trained well, but also wanting to make sure that they're effective in enforcement. And if they're not, to understand what that linkage then to police officers may be, whether they be transit police officers or city police officers. That handoff is going to be so important. Otherwise, it's just not going to be effective in these cases where there is a refusal. So I would want to make sure that we're also recording, of course, refusals, ticket refusals. There's a question in there somewhere. was. I can state it better, maybe. You know, tell me about how we're preparing for those occasions.
Sure. Chair Chambliss and Councilmember Carter, very great question and something we've really been working to address. You know, how do we, you know, give them enough authority, I think, to carry out the duty of fair inspection and to give someone a citation if needed, but not be police officers, right? To be more approachable. So we've really been working on that balance. At this time, I've got about a 4-week training plan mapped out that's going to cover a variety of different things, with some good time spent on both how to issue a citation, how to approach somebody, you know, sort of that customer service angle, but then also write the citation and de-escalate if somebody does refuse. And then they will be carrying radios, which will connect with our dispatch, so they will be able to ask for police assistance if needed. You know, we also have our real-time information center, so we've got the video piece overhead as well, which also goes to your point too about evaluating our training. Let's look at videos. Let's see what's worked, what hasn't. I think that's a really great point. So yeah, it's, you know, I can't always promise that it's going to go great. You know, we know that there's going to be situations, but I will say that we're really putting an emphasis on training to make sure that folks are successful.
And I'm so glad, if I can just do a follow-up briefly, I'm so glad that you not only responded regarding the police handoff, but there's also that review our own performance piece. That's really important. The last thing I'll say is that you did mention that you are focusing on riders and on underserved for those trip personnel, and I think that's good too, because we want to make sure that that relationship is assisted by that sort of experience, familiarity. And so I'm really enthused and encouraged with this work moving forward. Thank you. Thank you for it.
Councilmember Johnston.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Great information. I really appreciate all of this. 2 things for me. How, you know, it's very hard to find help right now. We are experiencing that all across the council. So, and I've mentioned to Lesley, and I actually, in management, we're checking all the, you know, lines of business here at the council on how we're doing on filling vacant positions. Now we're bringing on new people. And we don't have to say, you know, what we think their salary will be right now or their hourly pay or whatever that. I understand we probably won't be able to do part-time, so they will be full-time. But I'm just curious as we really begin to ramp this up as soon as possible. And I don't need, you know, but just maybe at some point bring to the council what those strategies are going to be so that we can get people fully trained. They will be facing a lot of challenges, but I think they will be having, hopefully understanding the meaningful work that they're doing. So it's kind of, I think, something you've kind of got to be built for. And as Ed mentioned in an earlier conversation, we've already got people in community that are doing some of this without pay. They might be great first looks at who we can say, would you like to do this, or do you know others in the community who have relationships and have a vested interest in whatever it's not a territory or whatever area they're covering, what their assignment is. So I'm just interested in that because, you know, that's been the challenge, whether it's, well, just across police, operators for transit, maintenance, IT, everybody, right? So that's just something I'm very keenly aware of, and we're bringing some of that stuff to management just to see how we're doing. The second thing is, actually I have 3 things. The second thing is, will we be able then, when our contract ends for the 2 years worth of security at some of these stations, do we think that this might impact that, because we had a $6 million contract for 2 years of security at certain station locations, and we're seeing some positive results from that, but that I think was an interim goal. So how do those things relate? I don't think they're one-for-ones, or their work isn't identical for sure, but how might we be then getting towards sustainability as it relates to our code of conduct and people, you know, feeling safe and behaving the way they need to on and at our facilities. And then last but not least, maybe you touched on this, but you know, what do we do about folks who aren't going to pay, aren't going to come, aren't going to contest, may not have an address, may not have a place where we can find them, may not have an ID. You know, this is a system built for people who have all of those things and go, gosh, I really know I should pay this and I really would like the discount and I'll never do it again in front of a hearing officer typically. So, you know, the citation is given, but then what if we just lose the person in the system? Because a lot of our folks are either there because they're needing that service, they might not be able to afford to pay, they might become a victim themselves from other bad actors who are there. So how do we manage that segment? And the only reason I say that is just having been a city official for a long time, we had asked for administrative fines too, and it's a little different, maybe not apples to apples, but you know, we then became the one that had to be in charge of managing it. So does it ever get kicked into then back into law enforcement? But again, I don't know what we require of somebody when they get the citation. Normally a police officer is asking you for some ID if there's probable cause for something. So I just don't know what to, I think there will be a fair amount of that. I'm at certain locations, just having been on the system a little bit. And how do we support our trip personnel when it comes to those kinds of scenarios? So really the first two are me just being interested in how we're going to get to where we want to go, but the last one is more of what is the plan and how do we manage for people who aren't responsive.
Chair Chambliss and Councilmember Johnson, all of those are excellent points, and I took some notes here. With regard to your question about managing situations where folks, like you said, this is intended, right, or is built for people who will be compliant all the way down the line. So we've tossed around that situation, right? We've thought about what are we going to do if, how do we address this if, and so part of that is going to be built into the training plan, or that those situations will be built into the training plan, but also internally, you know, creating procedures, right? So what are our folks going to do? So we do expect that people may not want to give an ID. Hopefully then we can just say, or maybe they don't have an ID.
Well, that's
right?
it. They might not have an ID,
Yeah.
they might not have an address,
Right.
all the things that kind of eventually spiral and people are ending up where they are.
Right,
You know?
right. So I think part of it is going to be what I would really like and envision for the trip officers is that they'll be familiar with, you know, with transit and transit riders. And there's a good section of those people that, you know, we know from police officers and we know from operators and we know from others that they're just familiar, right? It's people who are always there, who may be sleeping all the time or, you know, sort of aimless, right? And so what I envision is that the trip personnel will get to know those folks as well. And it, again, will be less about, here's your citation, go pay it, and more about maybe that person really does need the social services. Maybe that's the correct route. So we may not be able to collect on everything. People might just go into the wind. You know, and from a revenue perspective, we'll be working that out. You know, what are the reasons why somebody can't, why somebody doesn't have an ID, why somebody isn't paying? If we can figure those things out, we'll be addressing them.
And Madam Chair, I think I could be wrong, but I think we know a lot of those answers because the HAT team is out there, and those are a lot of those folks. And those are folks I would say too that are living a hard life right now for all kinds of reasons. So that's one category of people. And I don't know how you're going to deal with that because it's difficult for social workers, it's difficult for the HAT team, but you know, and you're right, the officers and the operators see them, but we're now bringing in a new set of people who hopefully will get familiar and we can retain those workers so we don't have churn and you know, every 3 months new people are coming on. We have to think about that. So, you know, it's very hard, you know, to gain compliance, but that's what we're trying to do. So I would really try to put some emphasis around that to help figure that out because they will show up here, they will show up there, but we might have to figure some other tactics to help them, you know, gain housing, you know, get their mental health support for drug addiction, support because maybe they are battered and abused, whatever it might be, and that's where those social service dollars that we're going to be getting will come into play. And then I want to just transition over to this other group of people that hang out around our stations and our stops and on the trains, and they're the ones that are preying on other people, and they have criminal records. And I would like to know, okay, if they don't pay, then what? Because they could care less, I would imagine, about a little written ticket when they've got drug deals going down all the time, and I'm just being very blunt. That's a problem for us. So we've got a lot of folks that are riding the train. Some are there for all the right reasons, whether they're paying or not, and some are there for all the wrong reasons because they're trying to make money with this, drug economy and fentanyl. So I'm trying to figure out how a ticket or how, we know who they are too, even if they get sent and, sent to the county attorney's office. A lot of times our officers are saying they're seeing them back within, 2 to 3 days. So I don't know how this trip personnel is going to handle that, and maybe that then gets kicked over to police officers if they're witnessing illegal activity because they're on our trains or buses without paying a fare. And the only reason I'm digging in here is that's the problem we're trying to solve, right?
And Chair Chambliss, Councilmember Johnson, you just answered the way I was going to answer. Is I think what we're striving for here is to create layers of presence. Our police officers will still be out there, our supplemental security, and then these transit rider investment personnel, in addition to the transit service intervention project, contract that we're bringing on to. So the idea is the more presence we have out there, even though people will have different roles, it's more eyes and ears and more opportunity for us to coordinate and when necessary, bring the police department in. And so, yeah, it's not an answer so much as just reiterating what you're sharing too is the idea is the more we're out there, the more we're monitoring the situation, the more likely we are to be able to address it effectively.
And I appreciate that, and I think we'll be learning this, in real time.
Yes.
And you guys are the perfect people to be doing this. I appreciate your hard work. And I would just say too, a trip personnel could come up to somebody who's having a mental health crisis moment and, or they get issued a ticket we might never see. I mean, you're gonna have a lot of names on tickets that might not be who they are and what they're, so if you can collect that data too, and into another category or two, so we can at least understand, how much of the problem is something that even this might not be quite the right solution for. I think this is wonderful, so I want to give you my full support, and I appreciate whatever, again, we can do to be here for you with policies or support in any way we will.
Thank you. Councilmember Wolf and then Councilmember Tyrone Carter.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Most of my questions have been already asked and answered, but I have some concerns about the Narcan, because we treat it like it's Tylenol or something, and it's not. And I realize they're going to get training to some degree, but there are people who, when they come down from their high and find themselves in sudden withdrawal, wake up really angry and combative. So are we going to be keeping track of those safety issues? Because if our people are getting hurt trying to do that, then we need to go back to the legislature and say, you thought this was a good idea, but this is really dangerous, and maybe we need to look that part.
Thank you, Councilmember Wolf. I think that's a good question, and I know in the implementation timeline, we're going to have multiple chances to ask questions about the evaluation process. And I know that in Q4, we're going to be talking about, or you're going to be evaluating the tracking as well as the program evaluation. So can you respond to that question? I mean, part of the reason that we're having more personnel is to deal with the various social issues that we have, not just the mental health issues or the homelessness, but also people that have medical addictions.
Chair Chambliss and Councilmember Wolf, it's a very excellent question, and it's one that I've been considering. So for this position, I worked for the Metro Transit Police Department, and before that I've worked for a couple of other police departments. So this idea of Narcan and how the officers use it, now we're going to transition it into more of a civilian type of situation. it's very real. So I've been speaking with the sergeant at MTPD that handles it to get a vibe on how many assaults are there, right? How many people are waking up agitated, because it does happen. And so we're working out those numbers. You know, the data or statistics aren't an end all be all. We still need our people to protect themselves. And so how do we train them? They will be, you know, if they come across a situation like that, again, they do have that radio to phone into or call into TCC. And so make that call and get ambulance rolling before you issue Narcan, if at all possible. And the benefit of having them work in teams or more is that one person can start administering that first aid while someone else is on the radio.
Councilmember Carter?
Yeah, that was gonna be my question about team deployment, because if you're one person out there and particularly issuing Narcan, the anger is associated with it. Another thing, I was just trying to visualize the layers, because this is a layered approach, right? And so maybe you've already presented that, but if we could see something just showing the different layers and how those layers, when I know there's always going to be some overlap, just how they fit in with each other in an ideal, and there is no ideal way, but typically how they're going to fit in. Because I know a few months back we were talking about red kite. Are they going to be part of this?
Chair Chambliss and Councilmember Carter, we're still working out that exact detail. I don't know that they're going to be part of red kite specifically. They're going to receive a lot of similar training. If not, I'm still trying to work that out.
Okay. Because I went to Philadelphia in June, and I actually visited with the chief of, he probably told you, and just because I was there and I wanted to get some insight, because I grew up in that system, so I thought I could get a good insight and be analogous to what we're doing, and we're headed in that direction. So, so that's why I had the question about the layers. How do all these layers fit? And probably in the beginning, they're not going to fit, you know, the way we want them to fit. But over time, we're going to learn some lessons, and it's going to get better. But I think the more we can learn about that early, it's going to help us too. So.
Thank you. Councilmember Barber.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you so much for the presentation, and thank you, council members, for the very good discussion about it. Much more of a comment. Very excited about this. This is an element of the transit system that we've been envisioning for many years, of how do we provide a layered, broad-based approach to how we both provide information and services to customers, but are also provide tools for safety and security. It was further expanded with the Safety and Security Action Plan. And this last session, the legislature gave us tools to be able to do some of these things, like the Transit Safety Intervention Program, this TRIP program, the administrative citations. We're gonna, I expect over the next couple of years, are gonna have a lot of things to work out. There may be clarifications that need to be made with the legislation. But I really want to commend the work at Metro Transit and Metro Transit Police Department to respond and build this so quickly. I mean, if we think back, the legislature ended at the end of May, and we're talking about things that we're going to deploy on the transit system now that will help our riders. And I think that's, you know, our riders and our operators. And I think it's been so key to be very responsive, very engaged, asking the right questions. But I just couldn't be more pleased with all of this to have something that is not a cure. This is not the cure for everything. It's not a one-size-fits-all, but it's certainly one piece of the puzzle. And the more pieces we pull together, the more successful we'll be. And I know we're getting a lot of outreach from other agencies across the country. How are we doing these things? And I think it's through a lot of creativity and a lot of hard work. So just want to thank you all.
Thank you, Councilmember Barber. Councilmember Osmond.
Yep. Well, thank you for sharing this information. I think this trip event will create some sense of security and safety for the customers. But my question is, although they are not sworn police officers, will they allow to ask IDs for the citations? And if the violator will not provide the ID, what will be the next step? Because they are a police officer.
Can you repeat the question, because I know he doesn't have a mic?
Chair Chambliss and Councilmember Osmond, the question was if somebody doesn't produce their ID, how do we address that situation? So first of all, yes, they can ask for an ID, but because they're not police, no one is compelled to give them their identification, right? So we're basing it on that. Now, if someone doesn't want to provide their identification, doesn't want to provide a name or any other identifying information, the troop personnel will still ask them to leave the station, leave the platform, leave the vehicle, as a matter of, you're not following the rules, you need to move along. If the situation escalates from there, again, we've got the police backup and things like that, just trying to facilitate people paying the fare. And honestly, it's something that other people are going to look at too. They're going to say, well, how come this guy didn't get a ticket? Well, okay, he wasn't cooperative, but we're doing what we can to move the person along and deal with it that way.
Thank you. I just had one more question, and that is regarding the wayfinding and prevention of fare evasion. Can you speak to the tools or the training? Tool might be a sign, fares being enforced or something like that. It's probably a lot cheaper for people to make that decision to comply than not to comply, and they need a sign. You have less staff to have to deal with that. So what are the thoughts for wayfinding? I've spoken before about sometimes having to, want to catch that next train and trying to figure out where I can swipe my go-to card, which machine. So what are we doing to help with that wayfinding?
Yeah, Chair Chambliss, it's a very good question. So part of it is that we are looking at improving the signage at different locations to really make it very clear. This is a paid fare zone. And part of what the trip agents will be able to do too is, oh, you don't have a fare? Okay, here's the machine, here's how this works, and educate people too, right? And then in terms of wayfinding, just generally how do you find your next ride? We envision them having some sort of a tablet or something where they can have access to metrotransit.com, which will have the scheduling system on there. They can pull it up and say, oh, okay, where are you going? Here's the best way to get there. Over time, and working with other people at Metro Transit, they learn these things and say, oh, the 22 goes from XYZ place to wherever. And so, but they'll have the tool, right? They'll have a tablet or something to be able to help that person get on the right route.
Great. Well, thank you. If there are no other questions, I think we will move on. Thank you so much for that presentation, and we're looking forward to reviewing it once again for October. Thank you. Next, we have the equity framework for Imagine 2050 with Ms. Angela Torres and C. Terrence Anderson of CURA.
Hi, Chair and Council members. It's good to be here with you again to talk more about the equity framework for Imagine 2050. I'm Angela Torres, the Senior Manager of Local Planning Assistance and Community Development, and I'm here with our partner in this work, C. Terrence Anderson, Director of Community-Based Programs at the University of Minnesota, Center for Urban and Regional Affairs. Look at that, I got that all right. Today, we'd just like to share a quick refresh on the statutory foundation for the approach to equity in the Regional Development Guide to recap the approach to equity with the goal of asking for the Council's endorsement of the equity framework in Imagine 2050. We'll talk about next steps then as well. According to state statute, the Metropolitan Council shall prepare and adopt a comprehensive development guide for the metropolitan area. The next part of that statute goes into a description of what should be included in that. I think that the council has always been very good at focusing on the orderly and economical development part of the statute, and I think that bringing to the forefront the second sentence of this statute, focusing on the physical, social, or economic needs of the metropolitan area, really supports the work for equity within the Regional Development Guide. Just a quick recap on the equity approach thus far. We've been focusing on the internal work, making sure that staff are trained to have a consistent voice in working with the equity framework. We would like to bring that out to the more broad, the broader part of the regional development guide, really centering equity in the process and policies, where we're at the policy writing stage now. As we're preparing discussions to share with council, having an equity framework in order to do that is really helpful. As you are aware, this council has endorsed a working set of values and goal statements to give staff direction as policy writing is underway. To implement the council's direction to plan for a region that is equitable and inclusive, we're proposing to use the equity framework that Terrence will briefly review, and then share some specific project examples that might help visualize how this could be implemented.
So you may remember, I think it was the midsummer, I was here to this exact room in this exact group to talk about this racial equity framework that we use at CURA, that we've been in conversation with Met Council staff, as well as the EAC in this group as well about what this might mean. Just to sort of do a little refresher, again, this racial equity framework actually started when I used to work at the council. I was thinking about regional planning work at the original point when this was constructed. And CURA's been using it for the past 5 years since I've been at the University of Minnesota on a realm of projects, which I'll sort of talk about the relevance and practicality of using such a framework in this work. But of course, understanding, right, one of those values and outcomes is a more equitable region. And so, of course, thinking about not just the sort of nebulousness of such a conversation about equity, but take it to a more practical place where it shows up into the policy programs and investments that the Met Council make, as well as the projects that it partners with different entities around the region to complete. So again, this racial equity framework has 3 core parts: contextualization, meaning that we sort of aren't just sort of talking in general about the disparities that exist in the region, but more importantly to talk about how did those disparities come into existence in the first place, right? They didn't just sort of happen via the construction of policy investments and programs of the past, and sometimes even of today too, of course. Community-centeredness, this idea that those folks who were harmed by this historic and present-day inequity should be front and foremost in a conversation about that healing, or about the projects, programs, and investments that we can make to sort of reduce those disparities over time. And reparative, the idea, right, that we can't just sort of exchange, the joke that I made here was exchange a shoe for a car lost when trying to address these disparities, but to try to find something equal in impact to the creation of those disparities in the solutions that we find today. I think another way that I really think about reparative is also just about broadening the scope of the projects that we do to include other elements in them. So I think I'll use some examples about transit projects that begin to think about housing and land use and environment in more complete ways as well too, and living in a way, or sort of practicing our projects in a way that isn't just about a singular goal, but more about a comprehensive goal or comprehensive plan that we might do over time. Sort of could be these challenges that every project needs to account for all of history, and I'll sort of use examples of all that. That's not exactly what this framework is meant to be, but to live in a more practical way in which we operate and deliver these projects in more concrete and deliverable ways. Another way I like to say this: equity isn't necessarily all projects, but they're particular projects that address the core causes of what created disparities in the first place. And I'll sort of get to that as well too. So just to sort of get to some examples where this has actually worked. So CURA has worked with a range of governments, and I think it'd be kind of hard to find a government in the Twin Cities where CURA hasn't had a relationship with. I think you're like in every one of your districts, counties, cities, of course the core cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul and Minneapolis, first ring suburbs, but also rural parts of the Twin Cities as well, and around the state, and sometimes even in western Wisconsin as well too. But just to sort of give you some examples about how we sort of may take equity conversation, which can seem very large, to become more particular using this exact framework. So one of the projects that we've been doing actually for the past 3 years is working with western and southern Twin City suburbs, so Edina, Eagan, Bloomington, Minnetonka, St. Louis Park, and Richfield, along with those governments in each of those areas to look at housing investment in those areas. And so we work with those various governments and community-based organizations on a research agenda to focus institutional investment in the housing market and its impact on tenants. Primarily, this work is being used to identify existing and potential tenant stabilization policies in western and southern Twin City suburbs, as well as increasing government transparency of the delivery of those policies. So of course, there's a lot to be said about Minneapolis and St. Paul and displacement and gentrification in Minneapolis and St. Paul. What we're seeing as a region is this overall demographic inversion, where we're seeing poverty grow in suburbs, and so it's actually our second and third rate suburbs, as well as exurbs that are growing in poverty faster than Minneapolis and St. Paul themselves. And so a lot of these governments are asking themselves, how do we sort of redefine the way that we're doing this work or refocus our investments to account for the growing population that we have? And this framework was used to sort of center that contextualization about why poverty might be growing or why it might be a different category of housing that might need to be developed in each of these different areas. But I think most importantly, it was about centering those growing communities which those governments may have not historically been very connected to because a lot of these folks were new, but rather into connecting them to those new groups into those areas, as well as bringing along folks who've been there for a long time to have this conversation in a mutually attainable way. And so this framework, of course, I think shifted, of course, the range of considerations that these governments were thinking about. Where do our housing investments need to go? But it's also about the way that these governments change the public engagement approaches to the various populations, new and old, in their communities in order to have this conversation, which I think sometimes, I'm sure you all know, can be quite tenuous, right? Can be very, very full of tension in delivering this project. I think out of this, a lot of sub-projects have come out of this. Like, for example, the city of Bloomington is looking at the Port Authority and sort of expanding the scope of its enforcement beyond just the Mall of America, but also into other parts of Bloomington, namely the parts of Bloomington where increasing poverty or increasing low-income households are moving into. They also looked into changing their own development processes into one which it really just depended on developers reaching out to the city and having those connections and say, hey, this is what we need, into a more formalized process that makes sure that they're delivering those investments across the broad needs of the city of Bloomington. Or Minnetonka, which has actually been one of the cities that has been growing in multifamily housing the most in suburbs around these communities, right? And I think, I'm not taking all the credit for this in CURA's framework, but I do think that this framework working with these different governments, right? Bloomington, Minnetonka, extremely different, right? St. Louis Park, Richfield, very different communities where this framework was used commonly between those governments, and more importantly, I think, the communities of people there to come around a common conversation around housing investment. Very much similar to the conversation that the Met Council will have, right? So Angela's local planning assistants looking at the comprehensive plans in the news these days about developing plans for the distribution of housing and population. Well, this of course was multi-government with community, right? Engaging long-range plan as well as short-range plans, looking at housing investments, which of course impacts Minnesota housing and the federal government's tax credits, as well as those owned in our region as well too. And so I think this framework will help sort of synthesize that conversation from an equity perspective rather than just this sort of, well, let's just do a little bit of everything and more get into what is it that our communities actually need that's not being delivered. So that's just one example. Of course, one that y'all probably all know about, CURA did do this project with the Met Council. I know I was here maybe a week before the last time I was here to talk about this. But this is, I think, a growth of the council in of itself and how it thinks about equity, right? I do think that the Blue Line Extension project is being delivered very differently than the original Blue Line was done. And I think that's because both community has different expectations. This agency has different learnings about this. I know there's a huge conversation about the Blue Line Extension in and of itself, but to consider not just the line and the ground part of this project, my work was really about what's everything else around it, right? Let's look at this history with, through North Minneapolis, Robbinsdale, Crystal, and Brooklyn Park to see why do people live in the condition that they are today. right? It's not just something that happened, but it is actually transportation, housing, land use, environmental policy that sort of delivered some of the outcomes and disparities that we see within it. And knowing more about it, the framework was used to sort of develop a more robust contextualization about how transit projects might positively or negatively impact any of those different things. And so that example of, right, this isn't just a transit project, this is a transit project, a housing project, a land use project, an environmental project. The Parks Board was part of this group as well too. So it's actually, I feel like the whole council is speaking to the Blue Line in ways that I don't think Central Corridor's Blue Line or even Southwest Light Rail did before them. Of course, this is another example of using multiple jurisdictions to expand the scope of this project, where sometimes it's been my history in government where it's been, well, we don't do park stuff, you know, at Metro Transit, and so you gotta go talk to the Parks Board in a separate conversation. Whereas this conversation, right, Minneapolis Parks Board, along with the Met Council and the cities, all sat at the same table to listen for their part, but also the other parts around it. Of course, significant to this is expanding really the way that public engagement is being done around light rail projects. I'm a big fan of Metro Transit's community engagement folks. In fact, I used to be one of them. They're awesome. But of course, we've learned that there's limits to governments doing all the working, and know that there is a good reason to partner with the community to advance common goals, right? And that's something that I learned at Metro Transit, not just in community, but this is something that I think the Anti-Displacement Project has also expanded the way in which the Met Council does its work. So what I hope y'all see out of this framework, of course, that it seems difficult in broad strokes. In some ways, it's sort of to speak both to the generalities of a regional development guide, but also that there's more detail that this framework fills in as you get closer and closer to implementation to the projects that might comprise a regional development guide, right? It's not going to do all its work within this process. Of course, the implementation has to take its part as well too. Just as housing didn't end, housing conversations didn't end with the last regional development guide, or that transportation work didn't end with the last transportation policy plan. Of course, this framework can be used more particularly around projects as well too. So, yeah, I guess I'll just give those examples, and I think I am passing to Angela.
Yes, thank you. I'll try and speak a little bit louder and also into the microphone. As the equity framework brings a focus towards a community-centered approach, I want to share just a small portion of the engagement work that's been done or is underway or planned for Imagine 2050. This is not all-encompassing. We do have plans to bring a fulsome engagement conversation to you in a future meeting, so I just want to be clear about that. But you can see where some highlights are happening, and those are examples of within the scope of the work that we have been doing of different approaches to really center and amplify voices that are historically underserved or underrepresented in government processes. And so there are traditional stakeholders like local governments, developers, and others that really have a clear understanding of how a government process works, of where to interject, who to call a council member, to call sector reps, some staff from my team, or to somehow engage, attend meetings, or other avenues. There's a lot of people across this region that don't have that ability. And so we're trying to really focus on different partnerships, new voices, voices of people that we serve, voices of people that are really impacted by our services or our infrastructure projects and other aspects of the work that we do, just really trying to broaden the scope of our engagement. And I believe that you were well pleased with one example of this in May when the Young Leaders Collaborative came to the council and presented their work that they had done. Building capacity to participate in government process was part of that cohort. And so now we have worked with more organizations. We'll be kind of talking about that second round of cohorts at a future meeting, but we are working to broaden that, continue that, and to continue to build on the relationships that we started when we did the youth cohort. So that's just one example. We just want to make sure throughout hearing the different feedback, hearing from different communities that we're actually using that feedback, and trying to be accountable to how that is showing up in discussions with policymakers, and showing our work on how that is showing up in policy development and the process that we're doing as well. So we are here today really seeking council direction on how to move forward. We do believe the equity framework represents the commitment to regional equity goal and the council's stated values. We're trying to provide clear direction to staff on the work that's going on with the Regional Development Guide, providing clear expectations of how equity should be expressed and visible in policy work that you all are directing. This provides also a consistent equity structure for accountability, and it definitely informs some of our next steps. So that is why we're here in front of you today. Happy to answer any questions about the implementation of this, the use of this, what this means for further accountability, and the ongoing work that's necessary in order to answer some of those questions. So I'll just touch briefly about the next steps so that you have an idea of what work the council staff have been doing. We have been working on definitions for equity and environmental justice. Like I mentioned, we're preparing to come with a more fulsome report of what has been done as far as engagement with traditional stakeholders and new stakeholders. We do need to discuss and draft equity objectives. What is it you want to achieve? See, Terrence was mentioning, like, what is the equity issue that you're trying to address? We do need to be more clear so that the policy areas have direction on what that should look like in their areas. And they've already done, just full disclosure, they've already done a lot of work in that regard. All of the policy areas are really focusing on equity. I've seen some really great work across the board with that work. But we do want to talk about accountability and how progress is measured in the future as well. So all of that work will help to inform like what this looks like in the Regional Development Guide ultimately if you endorse this as a process to move forward. Just to be clear, the equity framework is a tool. It isn't an all-encompassing answer to all of the questions, but it is a method and a process and a clear direction for how the work can be done in regional policy.
Thank you for that presentation, Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, this is great. I really appreciate it. One of the things that has bothered me for some time, and we know this, but it's the disparity between people of color and the majority white population in home ownership. So we talk a lot about development, and a lot of that is around affordable housing as it relates to renting, which is wonderful because people need housing regardless throughout their lifespan. It might not always be owning a home, right? You start in one place and end in another. But what I'm concerned about, and I don't know how we get our hands around this because I don't really know who controls this other than maybe local licensing, but it's the I think it's Blackwaters and the corporate entities that are coming in and buying up affordable housing. And I mean, you know, anything maybe 300,000-400,000 and less that needs some work. And it's then put into a portfolio where investors are all in on it and they earn equity over the years. And I don't know how we get a handle in the region on how much of that is taking place in our 7 counties.
Sure.
I'll just reiterate what I've said before. I know Maple Grove at one point put a moratorium on their licensing for rental housing. I think they were understanding that there was something going on. I'm not even sure everybody goes for a rental license. There's probably some violators out there. But what I'm trying to get back to is when, you know, redlining was taking place. I mean, just back a long time ago, from day one in our history, really. But how do we get people into that wealth building and owning your home and pride of ownership, and you've got a stake in the community and your children will have a stake in the community? We're losing ground on that. And we know that it's gotten worse since COVID. So who owns that space? We know that it's a thing. We have a free market. People can come in and buy the properties. But, you know, when you've got all cash investors coming in and you've got maybe 15 low income or moderate income families that are working and have a small down payment, cash wins every day.
Right.
So I know there are land trusts, but with land trusts, you only get to take advantage of the house that's built on the land if you move off. You can take some of your equity with you, but not all of it. So we've got solutions to get people into homes, not enough of that right now. But how do we get to the place where my mother was the first person that got to buy her home, and then I learned about saving, and I got to go to school, and I learned all the things, and finally I was able to put a down payment together. I mean, I want everybody, if that's what they want, I want everybody to have that opportunity. I think that's one of the biggest disparities we have. The next one then is wages, and I've been very clear at the council. I want to make sure that, you know, we're looking at job categories most certainly, but man, be a truck or a bus driver, be a police officer, be one of the new ambassadors, or I'm sorry, trip. You know, there's disparities, I think, just in job category here. So how do we address that as an employer? One of the largest government employers, probably behind the state or the counties, big counties. So I don't know how we can incorporate something that talks about that, or how we can work with our local partners who may or may not even know about a transaction taking place, or who do we work with? And I'm not trying to crush the free market, but things have gotten so askewed that, you know, to get in that game is tougher and tougher for people making pretty decent money right now, regardless of, you know, their background. So I know that that's a big question. You said tonight we aren't really trying to get to one question, but, you know, in some of our goals and objectives, what can CDC, or maybe there's other areas too. Certainly we're working on programs to help people get to home ownership. The home ownership center is working on that, but it feels like we're just not doing enough. And I don't know if this is anything we can really tackle, but it bothers me. That's one of the things, along with some other things, keep me up at night.
Chair and Councilmember Johnson, thank you so much for bringing up some specifics. That's a great point. I'll talk in generalities, and then let's see Terrence expand if he wants. I'm going to steal some language from ES staff because they're super smart too, and they've been framing some of the work that they're doing as kind of in buckets. What do? We provide. So sometimes we provide vouchers, we provide services for transit and other things. We also plan, we're responsible for regional planning, or we partner. And so in each of those buckets, there's a role for the Metropolitan Council. If it's not within our direct authority, that's where we partner. Or we plan for programs and grant dollars to be allocated in different ways. So there are exactly what you're talking about. We do provide service, provide, plan, and partner, totally stealing that from ES, thanks guys. But that is kind of the buckets of what we work with as we're talking about regional policy. But I do appreciate the specifics, and we'll definitely pass that on to our housing staff. They're working on
I probably say it at every CDC meeting I can. Madam Chair, if I may, I think those things are great, but those are getting people, you know, a voucher that gets them into an apartment. It's a grant that helps build a 90 unit, whatever. There's, you know, developers are making money on that too, and that's great. But I'm trying to get past where one segment of society is, you know, at best getting, you know, an apartment, and everybody else, and I'm overstating because I'm passionate in the moment here, but everybody else has a lot more opportunities. It might not be in our role. We have to work under state law, but if this is going to be the region's Imagine 2050, who do we get at to have in the room? You were talking about the right people in the room. I don't think we've figured that one out yet, and that's all I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah, and if it's okay, I would just say, you know, I have a lot of perspective on some of the particularities of the question that you're asking. I would say that it's probably been about 4 years since CURA's done a project around housing that hasn't started to discuss limiting investor-owned purchasing of buildings. For example, in North Minneapolis, where we used to live, I live, in 2009 there was one entity, Havenbrook Homes, that purchased like 500 homes in North Minneapolis between like 2009 and 2012. I mean, like a ridiculous amount of ownership, and like if you just saw the amount of homes that were going up in communities like North Minneapolis and St. Paul, but even anywhere really, right? The institutional ownership just went up, and that was a problem around the country. So I've yet to be in a discussion in the past 4 years, and CURA's been getting, we've been working with a lot of different governments around this particular question. And even in the anti-displacement recommendations, limiting investment ownership is one of the recommendations that came out of this because it's a significant issue. The other thing that I just want to sort of point out is that the outcomes that we get are sort of formulaic to the structure that's there. And right now, the structures of financing don't support alternative models of ownership. So for example, Cielo Sin Fronteras, a project by Inquilinos de Unidos por Justicia that they did where they looked at buying an apartment building from a slumlord in South Minneapolis, and they went through years of trying to raise the financing for the tenants that were to purchase the building and turned it into a co-op. They eventually succeeded, but there was almost no financial infrastructure and the ability for them to do that, right? So if you want to get a tax credit to redo a building, say from Minnesota Housing, those projects are not eligible today, right? And even have the conversation about where those projects at all were eligible was a big question. But I think just in a short way, the financial structures that exist today support one type of housing, which largely supports one group of people, or a much smaller group of people. And I think one of the questions that we're asking at CURA that I think community is just increasingly getting very lucid is about expanding the scope of opportunities that this infrastructure, this infrastructure is part of it, right? What are even housing grants that are available at the Met Council? What do those things support, right? I think we can expand the scope of those things too, as community becomes more clear, and there's more clear about what they want and what that looks like to expand the scope of ownership opportunities. So I would expect actually over the next 5 to 10 years to see a robust change in that system. And I can probably name some specific projects that CURA has worked on in terms of policy with Minnesota Housing and other groups as well around that, but I think that's going to change, and I think there's a great opportunity for this plan to reflect some of that movement that's been happening over the past 10 years that's now really coming to a very lucid and clear place as well.
Thank you for that answer and explanation. I think we are, having you seated here and representing CURA, we are starting to form deeper partnerships with you. I know earlier in my term, we also talked and partnered with MSP. So there are partnerships that are happening. I think we need to have more reports on how we can strengthen those partnerships. Deb and then Tony Carter.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First of all, thank you so much for this, but I really appreciate the work that's been done because I do think we need an equity framework. I think as an organization, probably council, all the different divisions, we still struggle with the definitions and common language around equity. I think that, and I'm going to channel Councilmember Pacheco a little bit because this is his big thing right now too, that, we really need to land on it. I think everyone cares about it, but even when we go back, and I don't know if the newer council members were a part of this, but we had these great look back sessions on sort of the comp planning process, and we had smaller city, Belle Plaine, and a bigger city, Bloomington. And they both talked about equity, but they talked about it differently because it did matter differently to their community. Right. But having that framework, for those tools, because sometimes we get asked by cities or planners, how are we supposed to do this? Like what questions are we supposed to be asking? So I think having some sort of framework will make things easier. We look back at developing the local planning guide and how helpful that was to community. If we do this right, it will allow communities to ask those right questions as they're looking at their different projects or whether it's through different divisions at the council. The one comment I had was I've been the chair of the work group doing the transportation policy plan, and what I'm noticing this cycle that's different from before is the language is very people-centric. Everyone's coming back to how does it, and for a technical area like transportation, that doesn't always happen, but you find that landing. So I'm really happy to see the words community-centered approaches, some of those sorts of things, because I think people are starting to do that almost organically through some of the work that we've been doing, because like I said, in the transportation world, it's a little unusual to see that, but it's definitely the way that the work group and the transportation committee and TAB are all talking about it. And if you know anything about all those groups, to get them all talking the same language is a challenge, and they're very much thinking that way, which has been very interesting. My question is around some of the next work you're doing on environmental justice, which I think is very important, clearly affects transportation and transit. So what kind of groups are you engaging for that discussion? Because I think that one's a critical one.
Chair and Councilmember Barber, thank you for that, those supportive words as well as the question. For every kind of area, we do have a specific engagement plan, and then we also have a plan to weave it all together. So we do have a qualitative research team that's bringing in engagement results from all over the place, and we are kind of combining that. When we receive the, I'm gonna get the name wrong, Climate Pollution Reduction Grant from the federal government, there were some specific guidelines in there. There's some specific guidelines for some of the other federal dollars that we're required to do to engage specifically with disadvantaged communities and low-income communities. A lot of the efforts that you saw, even just on this, really does target those communities, people of color, people with disabilities, age-friendly organizations, rural focus organizations. So we really are broadening that and bringing into all of those discussions so that we're efficient with the work that we're doing, kind of all of the pieces of the puzzle at the same time. So we are taking environmental justice feedback, feedback around natural systems and the natural environment in all of those pieces. We also have a very specifically focused climate and natural systems group, and under that, or with that I should say, an environmental justice task force themselves. And so internal staff structure to make sure that these things are moving forward and that they're collaborative, cross-divisional, and really trying to emphasize voices of the underserved, the most vulnerable in the region. So when we come back with the engagement update, we'll make sure that we're making all of those connections very clear so that I can give a better, more comprehensive answer.
That was a good answer, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Carter?
Well, thank you. Once again, this is just stellar work. I think that it has been evolving over time, and I'm very, very thankful for the partnerships that have enabled us to do this work, for the community-centered approach that you are using to guide it forward. I have so many fragments of things that I'm going to try to just narrow this down a little bit. But as we think about the upcoming work, and in particular the work that you're doing on definition, and some of the comments that council members have just shared, it does appear to me that there must be dedicated conversation going on around how we are defining equity and what we are looking at and how bold we can be. If in fact we're to reach our goals of being an equitable and a sustainable community over time, it does mean that we are going to need to be able to see more people in our communities succeed. You know, and I think about the equity pieces of this and the environmental justice pieces of this as almost one. You know, and you know, I know that there's some very specific EPA kinds of things that would make environmental justice much more specific than the broad lens that I have on it. But I think it is so important to understand how those two equate and work together. That's one thing. The second thing is that as I look at the 2040 Regional Development Guide and the great work that was done there to tee this up and to get this work started, you know, I often think about the fact that I was in Ramsey County at that time, and that my eyes and other eyes were open to the Metropolitan Council actually putting the word equity in the Regional Development Guide. And I know there were so many questions back then, even at the Metropolitan Council, about what that meant. But still, you know, the council was bold enough to add that word and the thoughts that evolved around why it was there, I think, can be credited with so much new work that has happened throughout our region and that is now embedded in every, I think almost every local government's work. And we're all struggling. We continue to struggle with what that definition is. One thing that I think I would absolutely encourage, if that conversation is not already there, as we think about wealth building, income generation, and leading to the building of wealth in disengaged and disadvantaged communities over the history. I think we absolutely have to think about that equity framework, including something around economic vitality. That equity definition, I should say. You know, we talk about where we live and where we work and how we travel and how we recreate. We don't talk about how we make a living, you know? And I think we've matured a little bit now to understand that's a very big part of equity. Whether we can earn income, whether we can save and generate wealth is a huge part of equity. And so I hope the discussion is embodying a potential change in that area. I think about also, as we talk about home ownership and the fact that it is so out of reach for so many, that isn't just an accident. Of course, that is a result of historic activity, inactivity, or interaction, and including by government. And so we, in our role and responsibility, have to take a very, very bold posture. If we are to ever think about equity being in reach, looking at those things and unpacking those causes that are the reason these inequities exist today. So again, thinking about income generation and wealth being as a part of where we live and, you know, how we recreate. Forgive me, I don't remember all of the words in that statement. Where we live, how we travel, and recreate. And I'm just positing that something ought to be there about how we earn a living and build wealth. Our statements, you know, as the planning agency, as the policy development agency, as the agency providing services to the entire region, are going to be foundational, just as they were in the 2040 guide. In the 2050 guide, not only for our work, but for the work of our partners, of other government organizations. And in fact, we can't do this alone. You know, we have to make certain that we're showing how we go with this, how we're building systemic inclusion and equity over time so that we can change the impact of systemic practices that have existed in the past. I thank you for the representation of this framework. I realize there's so much more there than you can show us. I'm anxious to see the more and appreciate the manner in which you're developing it with our communities at the center. And I'm absolutely ready to endorse the direction and the work that is being done here. Thank you.
If I could just sort of respond that, because I think it's always worth time to celebrate, and I think most folks know I used to work at the Met Council. This framework initially came. There's a number of people in this room that I can never really call it my own because it was inspired by conversations with people I actually had who still work at the Met Council, including Angela, Lisa, Lesley. I learned later, like I moved to the Twin Cities because of the 2040 document naming equity, and a lot of what Baris wrote in the 2040 plan is what actually got me to move to the Twin Cities itself. And you know, I can think of a number of examples of projects that I framed this framework around actual work that the council's already done. So, for example, Metro Transit's project a number of years ago. The West Broadway and the West End and Route 9 transit study that looked to connect people who make under $40,000 to jobs that pay under $40,000, and seeing a disconnect in that was a principle of principal importance, was something that inspired this framework to exist. Right? That's a project that existed before this framework was even stated. And so I just sort of want to put it that way because I think that there's lots of brilliance in the council who already have filled the imagination of this framework. I think what this action today does is give those people, those folks who in this room, who are not in this room, to continue forward with that work, that this sort of does make sense at the political level as well as the regional plan level as well too. So I just wanted to say that and sort of like, I don't know, I always want to like thank these folks all the time, but I just wanted to use.
Thank you for the
to say that.
context. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you to the council members for chiming in and hopefully giving you information to help you as you move the steps forward. And it looks like we have one more person to chime in, Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
I'm here.
I was pleased to see that you mentioned having a rural focus group with the Department of Ag. I think we need to go beyond just the Department of Ag. I mean, when you talk about people not feeling like they have a seat at the table, most of the exurbs and the rural areas at best think we don't care about them, but maybe we hate them and want to make their lives miserable. So having better connections there, I think, is very important. That, you know, we've worked a lot on being culturally competent on people from all over different places around the world and different backgrounds, but we don't have much cultural competence with rural parts of the region. They're kind of seen as them by our staff, and we need to work on changing that. There are some things that the council does that we're really good at being fair and equitable about. I would say environmental services, our sewer system, is amazingly equitable because everybody pays the same price all across our system, regardless of if you live in a place that's expensive to serve or cheap to serve, or it's old and needs lots of maintenance, or it's new and needs to be built. Everybody's paying the same price, which I think is great. There's, you know, I think Pittsburgh has like 187 different, I mean, it was a huge, crazy number of different sewer authorities, and so each one of them would pay a different rate depending on what their neighborhood or territory takes to you know, take care of that waste. So I think in that regard, we're doing great. I think on the transportation side, we do a terrible job of being equitable. Where, I mean, the discussion of Champlin wanting to leave Hennepin County is a good example of that. You know, we just approved another, what was it, $75 million for planning for the Blue Line, but Champlin is gonna have at least 4 years with no investments at all in transportation from Hennepin County. And that's systemic all across the metro. And we've kind of been unapologetic about it, which I don't think is right. I remember I spoke on behalf of the city of Lakeville way back. It was in the 90s about the transportation plan and how we were supposed to basically add the population of Golden Valley with no highways. If you look at Golden Valley, and it had all of those state, you know, Highway 155 and 12, which is now 394, and yet Lakeville was supposed to add all these people with no investment, and the council at that time basically said, well, that's what it is, deal with it, you know. And that's been going on for a long time, and we need to work on being more equitable about how we do transportation. You look at disabled people, if you're in the core or in the area that has good transit, you get full Metro mobility and they can't say no. If you're a little farther out, you can get Metro mobility, but they can say no. And then if you're farther out than that, you maybe can get dial-a-ride, but they definitely can say no. And so if you end up becoming disabled in the rural areas, sucks to be you, you know. But those are all people with the same need to get around with a, you know, Metro mobility type service. So just my 2 cents.
Well, thank you. And before I hear from Councilmember Barber, I just talked with someone recently on the council about how now that we have gotten over our fiscal cliff and we have more funds, how do we shift our thinking to reassign our resources? So I think good points made. Councilmember Barber.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Couple of things. First to the rural part, thank you for your comments, Councilmember Wolf. I think there are other organizations besides the Department of Ag. One of the things that we found, like going back to a freight corridor study, was the numbers got really biased because they just looked at corporate distribution of stuff, but it was actually, you know, individual owner operators, farmers who had their own trucks delivering stuff. And so there's some independent farm organizations. I think one of the first meetings I went to when I was on council was with Councilmember Wolf at the time it was the Scott County Farm Board that we went to. So there are some of these groups out there that are smaller in nature, similar to like neighborhood groups, but for rural farmers. So I would reach out to some of them. To the other comments about some of the almost this geographic equity that Councilmember Wolf was talking about, but equity and transportation. We have a big project ongoing right now that Amy Benowitz is spearheading, which is equity and transit or transportation investments, because you have these investments and because they're big dollars amount, it can really skew things very quickly. And we know that that's a way to actually put in equity throughout the system with some of these investments. And it's a project that's not quite done, but we're working on it. But it's something that we took to heart because it's very, very important. We'll have to have some conversations with the funding because we still have a transit taxing district and we have certain areas and things like that. But are there different things that we can do, because the counties have 17% of the sales tax? So are there things that they can do in the outer thing, and we can do matching grants or do something like that? So there's a very long-term conversation about, you know, can we be a little more creative without the normal constraints that we've had for so many years? So it's good questions to ask, but I think that we've not been in a place where we could have some of those conversations because of the fiscal constraints.
I think that's all of the comments. We have one more quickly from Tony Carter because we have one other information item.
Thank goodness for additional resource, and you know, it is really important that we do frame our thoughts around equity based on the ability for us to see similar outcomes. You know, it's really about the impact on people's lives. So when we are in a rural area and transportation impacts our lives so that it makes it more difficult for us, we do have to consider, you know, how do we ensure that we are able to see the outcomes that we need across the region. And I am really thankful for the framework's focus in this last part on structure for accountability, because that is the bottom line. We need to be able to understand the outcomes that we're seeking and then hold ourselves jointly accountable, not just us, but jointly accountable for being able to work on and prayerfully achieve those outcomes over time. So, you know, I want to add enthusiasm for ensuring that we are able to, across our region, be it rural or urban, whatever the case may be, ensure that we are addressing the needs and applying our resources and using our levers here on this council to be able to bring about the outcomes that we need.
Thank you.
So again, thanks.
Thank you for those words, Councilmember Carter. Councilmember Tyrone, we want to hear from you too. We do have one more item. And before you say that, and before I forget, I do want to also bring up that Councilmember Tony Carter also talked about definitions. And I think that's really important as we develop this framework. What are the definitions of equity? What are the definitions of equality? Councilmember Tyrone Carter.
I just want to say I applaud the work that you guys are doing. And I know it's a beginning, but one thing that I wanted to, hopefully we're going to keep in mind is that, you know, when the pie was originally divided, it was divided unevenly. And so I was glad to see the piece about reparations, because you have to try to readjust that pie and make up for what wasn't given, which has been built on. The other thing is, I know you're doing this, but I just wanted to, you know, bring it out a little bit more in terms of my concern. We're a change in Minnesota. Duluth is going to become a primary refuge area in terms of climate change, people moving from other parts of the country. But we're like a secondary. And so the demographics are going to change here. So anything we do, we have to make sure that we're working closely with the state demographers with those projections. So the plan that you may have thought of designing initially, it's going to change just because we're going to change. And you know, and of course the bigger change, the additional change that's going to go along with that is as our transportation system is built out, people will want to move out. And then that goes back to our original question about equity in housing and things like that. So, but thanks.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. More to come.
Thank you. I just want to real quickly, Chair, if I could confirm that it's a thumbs up.
Yeah.
Everybody?
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thumbs up.
I'll take that from You know what? I've always wanted an applause. Thank you.
Now we're gonna
Next, we have our final information item, scenario planning, transportation findings with Baris Gumus-Dawes. Welcome. And also Jonathan Ehrlich. And we also have one more person.
I hope we can do this in time. We are hoping to talk for half an hour, but I'm not sure. We're going to try to truncate it for you as much as we can.
Madam Chair.
You can, I think, because we've had such a passionate discussion, and your presentation ties very well with the previous two information items. If we could stay a little bit longer, council members. Okay, so that you can present fully. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Good afternoon, Chair Chapelis and council members. My name is Baris Gumus-Dawes, and I work at the Community Development Division as a planning analyst, and I also lead the council's scenario planning efforts. And I think 2 months ago, I was here to talk to you about the scenario planning framework that we have and mentioned the land use dynamics associated with them. And last month, my colleague Hillary Lovelace came and talked to you about scenario planning and housing. And today, Dennis Farmer and Jonathan Ehrlich, they will be speaking to the transportation aspects of scenario planning. And today, I just want to literally cover one slide to establish the connection between the scenario planning exercise and policy development. And we're hoping that you can see where we're going with all the string of presentations that we're bringing to you so that you have some sort of an orientation going forward. So in our presentation today, I will, as I said, just literally provide one slide, and Dennis is going to talk to the transportation framework in relation to our regional goals. And then he will be talking about the key transportation issues and the findings associated with them within the context of scenario planning. And finally, Jonathan will be sort of talking about the high-level findings, and he will bring us to a conclusion by connecting it to its land use implications. So I want to talk a little bit about scenario planning and how that relates to policy development. I've shown this slide before, but I just want to touch upon it briefly because it's kind of an important connection between our work and where we're going with that. So there is two phases to policy development or policy development via scenario planning. One is the analysis phase, the other one is the policy phase. And we're hoping that the findings of our analysis phase will be reflected in the policy phase, in that they would inform those policy decisions that you would be making. So we started with three components of the analysis phase, and the first one was the question of how the region's growth might vary. I specifically talked about 5 different scenarios, and these are scenarios that reflect 5 different regional growth patterns. So we're trying to identify how the region might develop in different ways. And then we looked at the impacts of these futures on the region, specifically on land use. We looked at housing, and we're looking at transportation today. And in the upcoming months, we will bring you more presentations, one on water resources, one on parks, and one on natural systems, and one on climate. So the hope is once you see all of these presentations, you will have an overall understanding of how these scenarios play out in different policy areas. So once you have an idea of how these futures would impact the region, then the last question becomes, how do these impacts align with our vision and with our goals? And we've been exploring those connections, and we're trying to basically provide some content for where those blue arrows are. And we're hoping that in that connection, we will be able to provide some information about how we can orient ourselves toward making policies within the context of an uncertainty. So once you know the future impacts of these futures, then you can consequently ask, how can we address these futures? How can we have policies that could address those particular impacts? And once you know about the alignments with our vision, you can ask the question, the main policy question, what policies are needed to achieve our vision given these uncertainties? And some of these policies will be at odds with each other. There will be some policies that would be promoting certain regional goals. They might be at the same time undermining other regional goals. So we're hoping that by gleaning this information from the analysis phase, you should be able to see the trade-offs and to be able to deal with some of them by seeing the consequences of all these policy decisions that you're making. Along the way, we'll bring you some visuals about these impacts and some policy options that are available to you so that you can think about this. And your policy decisions will be the backbone of the Regional Development Guide, the Imagine 2050. And hopefully they will give our staff some guidance about drafting the individual policy plans. So that's all I have to say for today, and I will turn it to Dennis, who will be talking about our transportation findings. Thank you.
Madam Chair, council members, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great, thanks. Yeah, my name is Dennis Farmer, and I work in the modeling and research section of transportation planning here at the Metropolitan Council. And I'm going to talk about some of the early results of these scenarios that Baris was talking about, specifically forecasts of what some of the outcomes, some of the transportation-related outcomes would be for each of these scenarios. To get these different outcomes, what we did is we took each of these land use scenarios that Baris has described now and in the past, and we ran them through the regional transportation model, which is the same model that we used to forecast transportation outcomes in our transportation policy plan. For this, we took all that population and that land use, and we assumed the 2040 transportation policy plan network, or the current revenues network for 2040, so the fiscally constrained network. We haven't assumed the 2050 transportation policy plan network, because that's in development right now. We're working on the transportation policy plan. So Thrive 2040 and the 2040 transportation policy plan network is sort of what we assumed to be the transit and the highway network that we looked at with these. Is this forward? Okay. So this slide shows we looked at 5 measures, and I'll explain what each of those are as we get to these slides. But as Baris mentioned, each of these 5 measures are related to our regional goals. This chart here is just something that staff came up with to sort of show the connections between each of these measures and how they relate to the working regional goals. So a check shows that there's a direct relationship between this measure and the goals, and 2 checks means that staff felt there was a particularly strong relationship between these 5 measures and these 5 goals. So The 5 measures that we got out of doing this analysis of this forecast of transportation outcomes for each scenario are, the first one is vehicle miles traveled per capita, and that's just a measure of
Can I just ask on the last slide?
Yeah.
Thank you. So where there aren't check marks, so job accessibility by car, healthy, safe communities gets no check mark. And climate mitigate, are we assuming gas? I mean, because, you know, electrification is coming. So is this still kind of under the, you know, I'm just, because I believe everything will be electrified, it's coming. So
Yeah.
is this kind of still under the, you know, what we assumed, you know, 10 years ago under the plan? I'm just, you know, I'm trying to understand,
Yeah.
is it still basically a fuel-based car that we're talking about?
Yeah, Madam Chair, Councilmember Johnson, so going into the next transportation policy plan, we have a lot of, you know, there's a lot of uncertainty that we're gonna have to, and things that we're gonna have to look at, and maybe even try different assumptions when we do the 2050 transportation policy plan. And a lot of those things are gonna be, for instance, market vehicle adoption for electric vehicles, and things like what kinds of telecommuting patterns that we saw that began to develop in COVID will persist. And that's going to be a substantial effort going into the, I think, the 2050 transportation policy plan. And for this exercise, we haven't tackled those particular assumptions about those things that are very uncertain right now. Partly because, and I invite Jonathan Ehrlich to give any input.
I don't want to get us in a rabbit hole.
Right.
Right, okay, because I know we're on time.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm just trying to understand, when we say car, there's an assumption that it's you know, gasoline or diesel.
Yeah.
And so I'm just trying to, and I'm also just trying to understand, you know, I'm sorry, I think multimodal. So I really hate to say that, you know, cars don't provide, I don't know what health and safe communities mean. For me, it was great when I had 4 kids, 2 dogs, a goldfish, and a whatever. I couldn't take transit to wherever I was going. And we all had seatbelts and we drove and followed the, you know, so there are just some, I just want to let you know there are some sensible comments around, is Met Council always trying to get everybody in transit and reduce, and so I'm just trying to understand the chart and what it meant when there were no checks around things.
Yeah, and I think maybe,
And we don't have to do that today, we
Yeah,
can have a conversation offline.
yeah, I think the chart is,
Yeah, let me ask a question and
Yeah.
maybe it'll help.
Thanks.
So I'm thinking that working regional goals are kind of the values vision that we're working on for the 2050 plan, like the green bar across the top. The other measures right now really are aligned up with the 2040 plan. And our intention with some of this is to get those to align to the 2050 plan ultimately. Yes?
That helps, thanks.
Thank you.
I just want to look forward, not backwards.
Thank you.
so the key transportation concepts that we're looking at, the first one is vehicle miles traveled per capita. And that's just basically the average number of miles, vehicle miles, that people travel, that a person travels on a given weekday. And the reason why we looked at that is that vehicle miles traveled are a contribution to greenhouse gases and other pollutants. The more people travel, typically the more greenhouse gases we get, the more pollutants we see. That ratio might change as we see transitions into other types of technologies. But travel is usually associated with more travel, or given assumption about what kinds of cars people are driving usually leads to more greenhouse gases, more emissions. It also is related to other things like like road wear, crashes. Congestion is often related to VMT, so that's one reason why we're looking at that. We're also looking at greenhouse gases because, as we discussed, they're a main cause of climate change. In turn, transportation is one of the major contributors to climate change. So we are looking at how transportation affects greenhouse gases emissions. So those are 2 of the 5 measures. Another couple of measures we look at are job accessibility by car and transit. And what that is just a measure of how many jobs you can get to within 30 minutes by either car or by automobile. That factors in, that looks at the travel times coming out of the model, how fast people are able to travel due to congestion, how fast they're able to get to places because of what kind of transit system we have in place, how extensive it is, and how frequently it goes. and it rides. The other thing it looks at is how close people are to things. So it's a measure of both the transportation system as well as land uses. So we've looked at that under the different scenarios. We've also looked at how many people are living within certain transit market areas. So transit market areas are an estimate of the local, what kind of service local bus ridership could support. So transit market areas 1 or 2 are areas that have high levels of transit service. And areas 4 and 5 at the other end are areas that are really only supporting express service or dial-a-ride service. So we're looking at how many people within these scenarios are living in those transit market areas or would be served by those transit market areas. So the first thing we're looking at is using the model, we're comparing the vehicle miles traveled per capita for each of these 4 land use scenarios that Baris just discussed, and we're comparing them to a business as usual scenario. So as you probably heard, a business as usual scenario is basically what the region would look like if we see current trends, some of the things that we've seen over the past 10 years, what the region would look like if those trends continued into 2050, whereas the other land use and growth scenarios look at different land use and different levels of regional growth that we get. So just to give a sense of scale, before COVID hit, we were at about, the region averaged about 25 vehicle miles traveled per person. And during peak COVID, we were probably at about, that dropped to about 20 VMT per capita. And now we're starting to see a trend back upwards towards about 23 vehicle miles traveled per person. That's what the business as usual shows, but if we look at the VMT that's produced by the other scenarios, we notice that in both of the compact scenarios, both the high and the low compact scenarios, the VMT per capita is lower than the business as usual. Depending upon the level of growth, it's anywhere between 3% to 1% lower than the business as usual. If we see dispersed, it's a little bit higher. It's between 2 to 3, depending on if we have a high growth, which is a lot of new people in the region, or low growth, which is historically lower growth rates across the region. So these might seem like small differences, but one thing to remember is the VMT per capita is the difference for averaged across the region. So a small increase or decrease in VMT is multiplied by anywhere between 3 million to 4 million people, depending upon if we have a high growth or a low growth scenario. So this happens for a couple of reasons. It's not just, when we looked at kind of what we're seeing coming out of our forecast, it's not just one thing that's causing the VMT to go down under more compact scenarios. It's a combination of things. For instance, we do see a small shift away from people driving single occupancy vehicles to other modes of travel like transit, like walking if they're in a more compact environment, or perhaps carpooling. There's another thing in which we see people taking slightly shorter trips under a compact scenario versus the dispersed, as well as slightly fewer trips under compact versus a dispersed scenario. So it's not one thing, it's a combination of different changes in behavior that we're forecasting with the compact scenario. So.
Can I just one assumption? So the assumption, so the travel shed based on your, I think you said 30 minutes, is it how many jobs are available for a person at one location within a 30-minute travel shed? Is that what you started with? Is that you were looking for those areas that you were analyzing? Yeah,
that's one of the measures that we'll get to. I think it's right after this one, which is the accessibility by car or transit within 30 minutes. That's the 30 minutes. The daily VMT is just basically looking at how much people are traveling, how many vehicle miles the population is traveling, and then dividing that by the total population to kind of get a sense of how much does a person travel on a weekday now and in the future. Does that make sense?
Yeah, there's just access to jobs from where the person lives within that certain time frame, drive time. So yeah, that's good.
Okay.
Yeah.
The next thing we looked at is daily greenhouse gas emissions, and that's basically how many greenhouse gas emissions are coming from mobile vehicles. So think about them as tailpipe emissions under each of the different scenarios. And this is coming from information we get from the transportation model about how far people are driving, what modes of travel they're taking, and how fast they're driving. And also, one thing we notice here is that if you look at the top 2 bars, that greenhouse gases go up compared to the business as usual if we get more people. And that makes sense. If we have more people across the region, we're likely to see more travel, we're likely to see more emissions of greenhouse gases. So it's kind of a reminder that whenever we do show forecasts of what emissions will look like in the future, that's always based upon an assumption that we're making about regional growth. If we're forecasting more regional growth, then we are going to forecast probably more emissions. Lower growth, fewer people traveling, lower emissions. But one thing the chart also does show that if you look at a given growth level, whether it's high or low, the compact growth scenario does have fewer, about 4 to 3% fewer greenhouse gas emissions on an average workday compared to the dispersed scenario. So if you want to see what the difference is, we're estimating what the difference is just to land use. If you subtract the top 2 bars or subtract the bottom 2 bars, you see that we're seeing about a 4 to 3% reduction in greenhouse gases in the compact scenario versus the dispersed scenario. So Councilmember Johnson, the job accessibility by car in 30 minutes that you were asking about, this is where we're talking about how that differs across the different scenarios. And like greenhouse gases, we do see that accessibility does tend to go up or down whether we have high or low growth. If we have more jobs in the region under any land use scenario, those are more jobs that people can get to by car or by transit. But we also notice that if you do compare the high growth and the low growth, that the compact for a given growth scenario does provide greater accessibility by automobile. We see in the high growth scenario, compact growth has about a 16% increase in job accessibility by car in the dispersed scenario, and it's about 11% higher if in the compact growth scenario versus the dispersed scenario when you look at the low growth. So we're seeing that the compact land use in either a high growth or a low growth scenario leads to greater accessibility by car in 30 minutes. This difference, yes?
Yeah, okay, Judy, and then I have something to say.
Thank you. And then this is just staying within the 7-county region. So for example, I'll just use my communities. We are jobs centers up in the Northwest, and we get people outside the 7-county that are coming in that have like no transit. So yeah, does that factor in that we're providing jobs for folks beyond the region too?
Yes, we're looking, I'm trying to think if we calculated, if we're just looking at the metropolitan planning area or if we're looking at also the counties that are adjacent outside. And I think we are looking at, right now we're looking at the metropolitan planning area. So we're looking at residents.
The 15 county or the 7 county?
The 7 county plus portions of Wright County that are also in the metropolitan planning area. Okay. So this is the job accessibility that someone that lives in the metropolitan planning area would experience, I guess, would be how I would describe it.
And I just know that around those edges, we've got people leaving the metropolitan area and coming into the metropolitan area. That's a big deal. So a lot of the suburban communities have population growth that exceeds their resident growth during the day. And so so that's just not been factored in. And that's okay. I mean, we have to draw a line somewhere, but okay.
But yeah, it's something we could look at too. We could sort of look at how this accessibility influences communities sort of along the edges of the metropolitan planning areas.
The only reason I ask is when we were at Greater MSP, we did that the 15 county MSA, and we looked at it between counties, and it was really fascinating to see county to county, and so that's all. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I may have missed this in your presentation at the beginning, but maybe having some examples of areas where there's dispersed growth and areas where there are currently compact. That might have been part of your presentation before, but if you could send that to me and maybe the council members, that might be helpful. Councilmember Barber.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think we want to make sure we clarify in some of these slides, especially when it comes to transit. If you look at low dispersed areas, there's a large amount of the land in the metropolitan region that is not within the transit taxi district. So you take a city like Waconia, the largest employer in Waconia or the largest employer in Carver County is in Waconia, which is not in the transit taxi district. So their numbers would not really show up here because there's no transit to get them to jobs.
Yes.
And so we have to make sure that we're looking at this as sort of apples to apples. This feels a little skewed.
That's kind of how I wouldn't, she said it better.
Okay, thank you, and I know that you have set things that we're talking about in terms of accessibility and the compact and dispersed areas. Maybe having a little bit more context or explanation of how that is going to be used to provide resources or service or part of our TPP would be also helpful. I didn't see it as a highlight in the slides. That might be helpful for us as well. John, did you have something?
Yes, Madam Chair and Councilmember Barber. I think it's, so what these measurements of accessibility are is looking at people's ability to reach, destinations by car, their ability to reach destinations by transit. If destinations are not well connected, it doesn't mean that they're not real, or if they're not jobs, or if they're not important for local economies. What it reflects is the number of people who can reach those jobs, or the ability to reach those jobs by a transportation system. So if jobs are not connected by transit, they don't show up in this measure because people can't reach them by transit, and that's a significant measure of the effectiveness of the transit system, the effectiveness of the region. It doesn't diminish the economic value of the jobs, but it is a measure that we are calculating and portraying the same way across these different scenarios.
Thank you. Again, how the measurements would be used, I think, would be helpful for us to understand, how staff is going to use that information. Councilmember Barber.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And in my mind, the way I look at like the high compact, high dispersed, low compact, low dispersed, it's almost like a SWOT analysis, strength, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. And so, the way this information feels, that I'm a technical person, for those who don't know me, I'm an engineer, so I look at this from both sides, but I like, well, low dispersed, that's bad. So, and when so much of our region is low dispersed, and it's just because we are a large percentage of agricultural land and rural land, and things like that, but that's, if I were somebody from one of the outer counties and I had no other information and I came in and saw that slide, that's what I would think. And that's why I think you're hearing some of these questions.
Yes.
Not good, bad, or indifferent, but it's the perception.
Councilmember Carter.
I endorse that as well, that looking at it out of context could give us an impression that is not intended. I feel as though these are showing us potential scenarios and what would happen in those scenarios. But we also have to ask the question, how do we impact those results? And I think that's a question that, we're all feeling up front. It's like, well, yeah, if we have more transit, we'd have more job access in those areas. So I'm not judging an area as I look at this, but that context is needed somehow to really make it clear that we are talking always, as we look at these individual slides, about scenarios that are potential and that would have certain impacts. We also have decision-making ability to think about mitigating those impacts. So that's how I'm looking at it.
Thank you. Ms. Baris.
Thank you, Madam Chair, council members. I just wanted to add some context maybe that will help. And I know that we're in this work all the time, and sometimes we forget that you all aren't in it all the time too. But the scenarios, the dispersed and compact, are based on what's in existing comprehensive plans today. Low is the lowest allowable land uses in densities in existing comp plans that are already authorized, the 2040 plans, and high is the highest. We're not saying that dispersed means we're going to develop the agricultural areas. That's not what they're planning for. But within the communities that are already planning for growth, that's what low and high are. Like if we do the lowest, if every community pushes down to the bottom of their allowable density range, that's what low is.
that's what dispersed is. And compact is the other side, is using their highest allowable density in their comprehensive plans today. So it's within that, the realm of possibility. And we use that because we've experienced that in this region. We have seen both growth happen at the lowest allowable densities, sometimes not consistent with council policies in that regard. And on the other side, we've seen communities maximize development within their communities. We've also seen on the amount of growth, we've seen market crashes and we've seen booms, all within the short period of time I've been at the council. Well, I say short, but about 15 years. Both of those things have happened, both booming and crashes. So that's what we're trying to, these are all within the realm of possibility under adopted policy today. So that's
context.
right. And so I wanted to share that context as it doesn't mean that one is bad or one is good, but in advancing your goals, we're bringing this to you to help think about both Councilmember Carter, what you're saying, what is the outcome we want to achieve? Or are there strategies or actions that we want to take in order to mitigate some of those effects?
Okay.
So I just wanted to share that context.
Because Wendy had her hand up. Wendy had her hand up first.
Well, you probably cover what I'm
Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It occurs to me that as technology changes, these numbers get farther and farther away from what the real impact is. 20 years ago, if you would have told me that I would see the Amazon trucks and the FedEx trucks and the UPS trucks multiple times on my little quiet cul-de-sac every day, I wouldn't have believed it. And so some of those vehicle miles traveled trips are not my trips anymore. They're Gary, the UPS driver's trip, bringing me something that my husband ordered online,
Yeah, now Councilmember Johnson.
And thank you, Director Barajas. I knew that. So when I said it, I will just simply say, because I get this, and I understand that these are the adopted plans, but there's just some, when I just say some communities will read this and feel as if that, oh, we're in the less than and we're not meeting the whatevers. And when you say, where do we want to be? That is a big question that we don't always agree on, and this body needs to agree on it. But I think that we need to, there's 20, 30 years of history with developing cities and redeveloping cities around this. So I think we just need to be very careful that when communities develop and they get through Met Council and they come back and they're being implemented, that we don't go and, well, look, on the low end, this is the reality, less ability to get 2 jobs. Well, you know what? That's how communities want to develop, and technology is changing. So I just think we have to be very careful how we frame it, because I will tell you, I have communities that will bristle if they don't really, I'm bristling, so they'll really bristle. So I know what we're doing, but we've brought this up in CDC before, and it feels like we're getting, a bit of a, here we go. So I know it's valid data, things are changing, we're doing the best we can, we're in the 7-county metro area, but I just, there's a sense that, certain cities have got it right, because look at that, and certain cities are outside what we really want, and that is hard for communities that don't have the resources, and I know you're ready to go, but, I'm just trying to explain what people will hear, and I'm praising you for the work that you're doing, but it's a big region, and we've talked about the geographic disparities and the transit disparities, and the investment disparities. So.
Thank you, and I'll just say that right now we're receiving information based on research of the as-is state, and we are wanting to take this information and apply it to policy. So it looks like we're going to have some further conversations after reviewing this actual data. So I will allow a response from Ms. Barajas, and then Councilmember Barber and Councilmember Wolf.
I totally appreciate, thank you, Madam Chair and council members, totally appreciate how we are communicating. We do spend a lot of time with staff from local units of government talking through these scenarios as we're thinking about things and sharing the data as well. And also reminding folks that compact can happen in any community.
Norwood's Young America's downtown is a compact downtown. Stillwater's downtown is compact downtown. So we're talking more about that, like within that, maximizing within community, not necessarily focusing all growth in one community of the region or two communities, but maximizing within community. So that's really where we're focusing on that. Again, like I totally understand the framing on that, but yeah, definitely building that with our communities and working with our staff partners and local governments as well to help them see themselves in this work and to also provide us feedback on what's working for them and what isn't working for them as we're thinking about some of these challenges at a regional scale.
Councilmember Barber.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm actually going to have a response for Councilmember Wolf. You'll be happy to know today at TAB we talked about the e-commerce study that we are running that will help inform the transportation policy plan because yes, that is an impact on our transportation system.
Thank you.
Yes, way to go.
I just wanted to chime in on the where we want people to live part of the thing. We have no say in that. They decide where they want to live and we provide them choices. If we don't give them choices and what they wanted isn't here, they won't come here, they'll go somewhere else. But ultimately, we're at the mercy of what people's lifestyle choices are and where they want to live.
Speaking of lifestyle choices, I do see your hand. The greenhouse gas part was really interesting to me. And to me, when I think about greenhouse gases, I think about not just transportation, but consumption. And the transportation that we focus on tends to be, our buses and trains and the cars in our region. But we also have airplanes, we have boats, we have trucks that are transporting goods based on our consumption. And our consumption impacts the emissions. And I think sometimes we just focus in on the urban consumption, and we're not really focusing in on the impacts of that urban consumption, and that most of those emissions, if you look at the charts that were presented to us, are showing those emissions are higher outside of the urban core. Councilmember Carter.
Wonderful, thank you. I was just going to comment, certainly on Commissioner Wolf's comment that we are at the mercy of those people who vote with their feet, and so too are our communities, because that is really what drives their decisions.
Great Adam Sandler was on our show.
Okay.
I'm just checking my messages.
That also drives their decisions, I would assume, in compact, versus dispersed development in lots and lots of ways. So it is a complicated puzzle. And thank you for pointing that out.
Councilmember Barber.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just to keep it very short because we're getting late. There's a big workforce right now on greenhouse gases going on, but I can tell you, like, one of the big goals set by the state and an assumption by a lot of greater Minnesota that the Metro will fix that and it'll average out across the state. And so we have to be very cognizant of that because goods move across the entire state to get to the Metro. So it's going to be an ongoing discussion about how to manage that over the long term, but it's definitely something we're building into the policy plan.
Great.
I just wanted to respond to what you asked, Madam Chair. We are also going to bring to greenhouse gas emissions for the entire economy by using a different model when we have our climate conversation. So this is just the transportation-based greenhouse gas emissions, but we're using another platform called Urban Footprint to bring that analysis. So hopefully in the upcoming months that'll be coming.
Awesome, thank you. You can continue.
Okay, I think in the interest of time, I'll go to this slide. So this is the final measure of that we looked at, which is the transit market area. And this is not coming out of the transportation model. This is basically just looking at those scenarios themselves of compact growth and high growth, and looking at how many people would live within the different transit market areas as they exist now. And as we can see, and this gets to that chart that we talked about earlier about why transit accessibility gets so dramatic when we look at different development scenarios, is because The transit market areas 1 and 2, where transit is where the highest concentration of transit is a pretty small footprint, and it's a footprint that's contained within where a lot of the growth would be in a compact scenario. So you can see compared to the business as usual, in the high compact and in the low compact, we see higher numbers of people living in transit market areas 1 and 2, as well as 3, which are the areas that have local transit, more frequent transit. And in the dispersed, more people are living in those transit market areas that are largely served by express buses or dial ride. And I think this kind of gets to a lot of what we were talking about. There's kind of two aspects to looking at these scenarios. When we modeled, we chose the 2040 Transportation Policy Plan network, not because we necessarily know that it's sort of just a kind of a benchmark. It's a way to kind of look at, to get a frame of reference. We don't know that the transit system will be the 2040 Transportation Policy Network, but we kind of assumed that. So I think to get to the question of why is transit accessibility so dependent or so sensitive to these land use scenarios? It's not just the land use scenarios themselves. It's an assumption about the transit network. So you can also change some of those indicators for a different scenario through a different assumption about the transportation network. And I think that's one of the reasons for this exercise, is to kind of show what things would look like under a group of assumptions, to see how we might respond, how our policies might perform under different scenarios, because we really don't know what the future is going to look like. So I think that's my final slide.
But
now Jonathan will take it.
there's a couple slides left, and we'll try to go through our overall findings relatively quickly. First, as I get into our overall findings, I'll note again that our scenarios that we're looking at are relatively modest in their impact. We're not looking at fundamentally changing the essential character of any community. Under both the dispersed growth and the high growth scenarios, Burnsville looks very much like Burnsville, Minneapolis looks very much like Burnsville. They were not making Minneapolis look like Singapore. We're not making Burnsville look like New York City. All of these places will look very different. These scenarios are relatively modest in their impact, respecting the comprehensive plans that cities have worked on collaboratively with us for decades. But looking at these scenarios, and then also noting that, again, we don't control where people live. We don't necessarily control what scenario is going to occur. We're just looking at these scenarios as possible futures and looking at what those impacts would be. But when we look at this through the measures that we have looked at, and we can discuss other measures to look at as well, our dispersed scenarios are more likely to lead to higher emissions due to higher VMT. Our state and regional climate mitigations are aggressive, and meeting them will be not very likely under any scenario, but less likely under the dispersed scenarios. Reduced accessibility means that people need to travel further to reach job opportunities and other opportunities. This may lead overall to less efficiency in the regional highway system, more congestion, higher traffic volumes overall. And when it comes to transit, the impact of scenarios in our transit market areas and the effectiveness of transit is relatively limited. This is the case primarily because our existing built environment that includes our past development patterns and road network has the biggest impact on transit market areas. In the scenario exercise, we're looking at the next 30 years, yet most of the region's growth already happened over the course of more than a century. In other words, the additional growth we're forecasting in the next 30 years is simply a fraction of what's already on the ground. An incremental change we are looking at doesn't substantially impact the footprint of transit market areas. So the last thing I will say before we open up to more questions and discussion is pay attention to land use, because we can impact all four of these things at once. Compact growth reduces per capita vehicle miles traveled in the region because it decreases the need for driving longer distances and the distances traveled, and the inverse. By reducing per capita vehicle miles traveled in the region, compact growth generates lower amounts of greenhouse gas emissions, and the inverse. Compact growth leads to greater job accessibility overall, and compact growth results in greater transit access, and the inverse. In compact growth scenarios, people live on the margins, closer to existing transit networks, and have better access to transit than their counterparts do in dispersed areas. That is our final slide, and happy to take questions or further discussion on our scenarios.
No, thank you for that presentation. You're talking about, what happens with dispersed growth versus compact growth, and the compact growth is what you're illustrating in the bubbles, if I'm understanding that correctly, right?
Correct.
Okay.
And the inverse, we could have stated it
Higher for the dispersed growth.
Dispersed growth leads to a change all the lowers to highers.
I can sit down right now. Okay.
Any other questions? Well, we've had some great conversations. I want to thank you for this presentation and all the presenters today. A lot for us to kind of reflect on, and as you can see, we're very anxious about what we're going to do with this information going forward.
Really anxious.
As we do not have a quorum, we will move the approval of the minutes off of this agenda, and that will have to be approved at the next committee of the whole. At this point, I will ask if there is any further business. Seeing none, I will call this meeting adjourned.